a little bit of background on climate impact on species distributions, and then I'll talk about some of my work, the work my lab's done on trying to forecast how species might move, and then how they might move across landscapes. And then if we have time, get into some of the adaptation strategies and approaches to for helping those species move as the climate changes and giving them a place to go. All right. So, oh yeah, I can't even see that over here, but I can click that. Maybe if I get over to that. What does it say? Being recorded. Got it. Let's see if I can just hit enter since that goes away. Nope. Okay, let me. I can't get to that. Maybe that screen's that way. Is it over there? You see my?
Yeah, go down.
Oh, I see it.
The other direction.
This way.
Over.
Oh goodness.
Yay.
All right.
Thank you.
Done. Okay. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, as the climate is changing, one of the things that we've noticed in terms of the responses of biota is that species are moving around, ecological communities are starting to change. We've seen species moving up in elevation, both plants and animals, and we've seen species moving longitudinally and latitudinally, in some cases in ways that we might expect given climate change, and in other ways that we might not. Okay, now I hit enter and it's not going anywhere. Come on back, cursor. I promise I will do this talk. Okay. This is from a study that was done in the early 2000s, and it was based on some Audubon collected data from the Christmas bird count. So the Christmas, yep.
So the screen, I don't think they're seeing the screen.
They're not screening the slides, the shared
They're
slides?
seeing the original slide. I mean, the original slide, but not the one that you just changed.
Oh. Interesting.
Let me see if this,
I've never seen that happen before.
yeah, maybe mine is frozen. Oh, yeah, okay, you're good.
Okay.
Mine is just frozen. Go
Okay,
ahead.
all right. So this was a study that looked at using Christmas bird count data to look at wintering bird distributions in North America and how they moved over about a 40-year period. So the Christmas bird count is an effort where people go out, they're volunteers, they go out and they count as many birds as they can right around Christmas Day. And those data get collected. And then in this case, they were used to compare two periods, one in the mid-60s to one in the early 2000s, to look at how the centers, the geographic center of the distribution of, in this case, about 300 bird species changed over that 40-year period. And they found that the majority of those species shifted their distributions to the north, on average about 35 miles to the north.
Yeah,
And
it's not in presenter mode.
it's not presenter mode. Okay, let me try again. All right. So let's. I don't understand. I've never had this problem with Zoom before. So what's everybody seeing?
We see this. We see the PowerPoint.
Yeah, well, let's see. All right, let me try again. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share.
I do like the bookmark thing.
I think there are two ways to share your screen. One, share the screen itself, one, share the program.
Yeah. And I was trying to share just the PowerPoint right there. Right? And then I was going to presentation, which is what I always do. That's so strange. Because it's doing it for us. I don't think so. I think it's only open once.
Okay, stop sharing.
I will.
And then maybe you can try doing the, there's like a book thing down in the right. Books.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now can you share that? Try sharing screen,
Sure.
see if that works.
Okay.
Okay, now can you go forward one?
Yep.
Yes, that's working.
Okay.
You can probably spread it out.
And I'll see if I
more
can
and more.
full screen that. Okay. Let's see. That's so odd. I've never had that happen before.
Okay, great.
Okay, let me
Leave the
get
blue
these
thing out.
guys off the screen here. Okay. Let's try that. All right. So bird species been around, wintering distributions, shifting largely to the north, but not for all species, roughly about half of them.
Can you move that thing out of the
Yeah, I can
way?
move that. Oh, you see that thing now? Yeah. You didn't see that thing before. You'd think I'd never given a presentation. before.
Yeah, he's just, he's just a junior graduate student. Okay, go, Jill.
I mean,
go.
I gave one this morning. Worked just fine. All right. So it's not just birds that are moving around. We know other species, other taxonomic groups are moving around. This was some work done by Malin Pinsky at Princeton looking at marine organisms, and you've got many different species of marine organisms, and these are all different species. This comes from catch data from fisheries, so it's fisheries catch data. And all the little colorful arrows you see on there are different species that are being caught, and then the big black arrows are generally where all the species in that area are moving. And one thing you see from that is that they're moving in different directions. They're not all moving north, right? Some of them are moving in very different directions. And when the authors dug deeper, they found that those movements generally were in line with where one would need to go to get to cooler water, whether that was cooler currents or deeper water. So not all in the same direction, longitudinally or latitudinally, but in directions that would take those species to cooler waters. So I also mentioned the species are often moving up in elevation. And this was a study that was done in Yosemite National Park, revisiting some transects that were done at the turn of the century, looking at where mammals were in Yosemite National Park. And so a team went out from Berkeley not too long ago, and they resampled all those transects to see if the mammals might be moving. And what they found is, again, roughly half of them seem to be moving. And so this chart, it shows across the bottom, you've got numbers, and each one of those numbers represents a different species. And then on the y-axis is elevation. And so each one of the bars represents an elevation range that the species has been found at. The hatched non-colored portion is where the species was found about 100 years ago, and where it also was found most recently. And then the green areas are where that's been newly found, so where it wasn't 100 years ago, but is now. And then the red parts of those bars are where the species was found 100 years ago, but not today. So you can think of those as little contractions and expansions of their elevational range. And you can see that for some of them, there are green expansions towards the upper elevations and contractions, red areas at the lower elevations. But for some of them, they seem to be doing the opposite, right? So there are some exceptions for sure. And then about half of those species appear to be in the same elevational range that they were 100 years ago. So that's some evidence that species are moving. As I said, there's also lots of evidence for butterflies and for plants and other taxonomic groups moving as well. Next, I'm going to shift into talking about how we might anticipate how species are likely to move in the future in response to climate change. And I'm going to start out by talking about some work that was based on a set of models that we built quite a while ago. And these are correlative models that link the current distributions of species or historic distributions of species to historical or current climates. And basically, they attempt to determine where are the climates, where is it warm enough, cool enough, wet enough, dry enough for a species to exist today, and where is that set of climatic conditions likely to be in the future, by then applying those models to projected future climate data. And so there are lots of limitations of these correlative models, and we can get into those later. We've also done some mechanistic modeling. I think you're going to hear from Lauren Buckley next week, and I believe she's probably going to talk about some mechanistic models and some physiological models that definitely get at some of the limitations of these correlative models. One of the biggest limitations is that in building these models, you're modeling what is the realized niche of where the species actually is on the landscape, and you're not modeling the fundamental niche, which is the actual climatic conditions that the species could exist in. And there are lots of things that are related to that limitation, but we can get into that if you want. So we ended up building models like this, and let me explain what that output of the model is. So you're looking at a map of a projected potential shift in a species range. And the light green areas are where the range is projected to be stable, where the species is currently and where it's projected to be in roughly 100 years. The dark green areas are potential range expansion areas, where it might move into because the climate might become suitable. And then the pink areas are where the climate might become unsuitable. So we built these models for about 3,000 vertebrate species, so mammals, birds, and amphibians in the Western Hemisphere. And then we made projections to 30 different projected climate futures, which produced 90,000 maps that look like that or similar to that. One of the first things we did was that we overlaid those maps, and we said where, given those projected changes, what we expect to see the greatest change in vertebrate fauna. And so you can imagine overlaying those and saying, where do all those pink and dark green areas overlap, the areas of expansion and contraction? So what might we see the most turnover? And what this map shows is that across North and South America, we might expect to see, on average, 35% under a mid to high emission scenario change in fauna in any given place, which is a lot. Some of those areas, the projections you'll see go over 100%, and you might wonder how can that happen? And that's merely how we calculated turnover. And so if you have an area that doesn't have many species in it now, but there are lots projected to move into it, you end up with a percent change that's greater than 100%. I had a student, Carrie Schloss, who said, well, those are interesting projections, and that's all well and good, but those models assume that the species are going to be able to actually move into those new places. They're going to actually be able to track those changing climates and move fast enough. And so she wanted to ask the question, whether mammals are going to be able to keep up, mammals in particular, are going to be able to keep up with climate change? Are they going to be able to move as fast as those shifting climates are? And to do that, she calculated both the velocity of the climate, how fast the climate that was suitable for that species was moving across the landscape, and the speed at which the organism could move over that same time period for which we made the projections. And climate velocity is a concept of basically encapsulates how quickly climate is shifting and moving in space. And it's based both on how much the climate is changing in one place and how much it changes over the landscape due to elevation, other factors, right? And so it takes into account that spatial factor of the stable, the unmoving spatial factor and the temporal factor, and you get velocity across the landscape. She looked at about 50 different mammals and used 10 different climate change projections. Again, these are older climate change projections from the 4th assessment report. I don't think I told you that yet, but they're older climate projections. And the way she calculated velocity of climate change was on a per species and location specific, in a location specific way. So she took the current distribution of those species and the projected future distribution, and she said for any place in the current distribution that's not suitable, not projected to be suitable in the future, how far would they need to go? Would individuals in that location need to go to get to suitable climate? And she calculated that distance, and she said, okay, that species would need to go that distance over the 110-year period of the climate projection, which means they'd need to move at 4.5, in this case, 4.5 kilometers per year. So she did that for every potential, in this case, grid cell in the species distribution, and came up with location-specific velocities, climate velocities for each of those that a species would have to move at. Well, you can imagine that you've got two different species and that same location, just because of their species distributions and their projected future ranges, that same location might have a very different climate velocity for a different species, right? And so again, these are species-specific and location-specific estimates of the climate velocity that would be needed to be tracked by a species. To calculate the velocity of dispersal, she basically needed to know how fast a species was going to be able to move across the landscape to match that velocity. And so she calculated that based on the distance of an average dispersal event. And you might imagine that that would be known for all species, but it's not. If you're an ecologist, you wouldn't imagine that at all. So we don't know. And for a very small number of species, we do know dispersal distances and dispersal rates. But for a lot of species, in this case, we had to estimate them. And we made those estimates based on body size. There are fairly decent relationships between body size and dispersal distances. In this case, Carrie used natal dispersal, which means dispersal after they're born. So it's a one time per generation, essentially. And she calculated the number of dispersal opportunities based on generation length, based on gestation length, and based on whether there was any seasonality to reproduction. And then she added some factor to account for variability in those measures. Okay, so that gave her a measure of dispersal velocity for a species as a whole, and then location-specific climate velocities. And she took those, she subtracted them to find out if where there were places where mammals, each species, might not be able to keep up with climate change. And again, as in the other study, she overlaid those and came up with this map, which gives an estimate of the percentage of mammals that in any given place might not be able to keep up with climate change. And on average, this is about, for this particular scenario, is about 8% on average across North and South America, 8% of mammals not being able to keep up with climate change. So after that study, the next question that we wanted to ask was, well, so a lot are going to need to move, and we know that some won't be able to move fast enough, but a lot will, and in a lot of places they will be able to move fast enough. So how will they move across the landscape? What routes will they take, and how will they avoid human land uses? So you can imagine when species have moved in the past in response to large changes in the climate, for the most part, when those major changes in flora and fauna have happened and major movements, there haven't been human-made barriers in the way. But now there's agricultural fields, there are highways, there are cities. And so as species move in response to climate change, there are going to be plenty of barriers to keep them from where they need to go. So we took these same models and we asked the question, how would they move into those newly suitable areas? How might they move out of those areas that become unsuitable? And so we did that. We did that using something called circuit theory. This is, I'm sorry, I changed the colors on you, but this is the same kind of map of a projected shift in distribution. The purple being the area that becomes unsuitable, the orange being the area that remains suitable, and then the bright green being the area that potentially becomes suitable. So we used a modeling approach that's based on circuit theory to model movement through this landscape. And this approach basically takes a landscape and it treats it as a circuit board. And each cell in the landscape, each grid cell in the landscape gets a resistance, and it's treated as if it's a resistor. And one puts electrical current, or you can think of it as putting a bunch of organisms into one part of the landscape and telling the program where they need to move to. And then they flow through the landscape, and the way they flow through the landscape is directed by the amount of resistance in the landscape. And so one can build that resistance layer and define resistance in a number of ways. This is how they might flow from the purple area into the orange area, and from the orange area into the green area, right? How they might flow out of areas that become unsuitable and into areas that become suitable, if there was no underlying pattern in the resistance, right? If the landscape was homogeneous. But we know it isn't. As I was saying before, there are things that are going to keep species from moving. So to model that, we used a layer known as the human influence index, or the human footprint, which takes into account the amount of impact that people have had on the landscape, or human presence on the landscape. And so it's based on nighttime lighting and population density and housing density and distance to roads and land cover type. All that information goes into this to give you a map of areas that are darker, where there's more human influence on the landscape, and lighter, where there's less. So we rescaled that so it would match the resolution of the data we had for the projected species ranges. And then we use that approach, that circuit theory based approach, to map potential movement. This is that same area that before was purple and orange and green, but now it's overlaid with the human influence index, with darker blue areas being less impacted by humans and lighter blue areas being more impacted by humans. And so we get those little arrows again showing potential movements. And this time they look a little different. And if you can't tell, trust me, they look a little different. So we did that. We used that analysis for all those species range shift projections that we had, and asking in each of those, for each of those, how would they move into more suitable climates. And then again, we overlaid those, and we said, where are there going to be, we asked where there were going to be more movements. So this is a map of tiny little arrows that you can't see from back there in your seats, but it's a map of tiny little arrows. The arrows that are larger and where there's more color on the map, those are places where there were more movements, more species, and more movements of individuals from a single species, or potential movements of individuals from a single species. The arrows that are redder are ones that signify more consistency in movement. And so ones that are more yellow, there's less consistency in the movements across the species. And so you see some patterns start to jump out there. I don't know if you can see, but there are two squares on that map, one in North America and one in South America. And I'm going to zoom in on those two places. Now, again, the blue in these two maps show where there's the darker blue is where there's more human influence on the landscape, and the lighter colors where there's less. And you can see in the map on the left, in South America, and you can see an area of red. So lots of movements heading south down to the southern Pampas and up in to the Andes. And then the map on the right shows movements in the southern Appalachians up into the Appalachian Mountains and along the Appalachian spine. And those are just two of the patterns, that fairly noticeable patterns that come out in these data. I had a colleague at the Nature Conservancy who took these and thought there might be a better way to visualize this potential movement. And he came up with this map. And in this map, the little yellow streaks represent movement of amphibians. The magenta ones represent movement of mammals. And then the blue ones represent potential movement of birds. And the streaks don't represent individuals. They don't represent whole movements. They're just to give you an idea of how species might be flowing through the landscape. And you can see some interesting patterns in there. You can see that the Appalachian spine acting as a corridor. And then you can see some corridors kind of emerging in the Western US. Some of that is driven by where the species are and where they need to go. And a lot of it's driven by the underlying landscape pattern, right? So where the protected lands are, where there's less human impact on the landscape. And a lot of that ends up being mountain ranges and protected corridors like that. All right, so next, I'm going to talk a bit about how we might plan for those changes. What are the sort of large-scale adaptation strategies we might undertake to facilitate those movements or to provide protection for species as the climate changes? About 13 years ago, a paper came out that reviewed the literature, the ecological conservation literature, and asked, what are researchers saying about what needs to be done to address climate change for biodiversity? And they came up with a long list. This paper just got updated and it looks surprisingly similar. The results look surprisingly similar today to what they looked like 13 years ago. But of the long list of things that people were listing in their papers as recommendations of what to do in the face of climate change, there were 7 that sort of rose to the top. The first was increasing connectivity of the landscape, so making the landscape more permeable to movement by plants and animals. The second was integrating climate change into planning processes, so spatial planning, but also other planning processes. Reducing other threats to species, so many species, most endangered species and threatened species are threatened by more than one thing. And so by reducing some of those other threats, it might make it easier for them to respond to climate change. They also suggested studying more of the biotic responses to climate change, which is not surprising, seeing as these are all researchers and scientists planning their next study and their next paper. So we always need more studies. They recommended intensively managing populations, individual populations of species that were facing challenges. They mentioned something called assisted migration or assisted colonization, which is the idea that we may need to pick some species up and move them to areas that will be suitable in the future because they might not be able to get there on their own. And that has been, those suggestions have erupted in a debate that it's not still raging, but a debate that went on for quite a while in the literature about whether it was a good idea to be picking up species and move them around. And I don't think that question's really answered yet, but it is happening. Species are being translocated in the name of climate change, and I suppose with varying success. And then the last thing I've got on here of the long list, the 7th one I've got listed is adding more reserves to the landscape. So there are lots of suggestions about reserves, more reserves, larger reserves, stepping stone reserves to connect reserves, things like that. So I'm now going to talk about 3 different approaches, 3 of those things from that list. And I'm going to give some examples of some of the studies that my lab group has done to try to describe what one might do in those areas. So the first one being connectivity, the second one being adding protected areas, but in particular protected areas that address climatic refugia. And then the third one being some conservation planning that takes climate change into account and accounts for both climate-driven species movements and connectivity and climatic refugia. So for connectivity, the way connectivity modeling has been done in the field of conservation and wildlife ecology is largely, the goal has almost always been to connect what is habitat now to other patches of what is habitat now, right? And so, and those are usually connected with areas that are largely suitable habitat. So it's fairly simple in concept. But most of that, and a lot of that connectivity planning will be useful in the face of climate change because species will need to move, period. But what that kind of modeling doesn't do is it doesn't connect species habitat, what's habitat today, to what might be habitat in the future. It doesn't allow them to move outside of their current distributions. So I had a student, Tristan Nunez, who set out to develop an approach that would allow one to map connectivity for species that would allow them to move outside of where they are now and allow them to move to areas that might be suitable in the future. And I think last week or several weeks ago, you had a talk by Mead Crosby. And maybe Mead talked about some connectivity, I'm guessing, perhaps. Yeah. She may have talked about this study. because Mead participated in the study. So we'll see if she did. So Tristan set out to build a network of corridors that connected places, and he wanted to link areas that were more natural, and he wanted to link slightly warmer areas to slightly cooler areas, assuming that would be helpful in the face of climate change. He wanted the routes that organisms took to get from one to the other to avoid human land uses and human impacts on the landscape. And he wanted them to avoid steep climate gradients. And I'll get to why that's important in a bit, if you can't already guess. So in terms of linking natural landscapes, he used something akin to the Human Influence Index that I talked about before. And he identified the areas that had the least impact. And so on this map, we're looking at the dark blue areas, and you can see a lot of protected areas that pop out. The orange areas on that map are largely agriculture, the red areas being our cities, right? You can see Portland, and you can see the whole Puget Sound area, and you can see Spokane out there, Western Washington. So he picked some of the areas that were the least impacted by humans and set out to connect them. So that was the first step. And then you remember he wanted to link ones that were warmer to ones that were slightly cooler. So he figured out the temperatures of these different patches on the landscape, and then set out to connect ones that were within a certain temperature range of each other and within a certain distance of each other, thinking that both those things would be helpful in the face of climate change. And so those little purple lines merely designate which patches he wanted to connect. And then the next step was to actually create a route between those patches that avoided human land use. And again, use the same human influence layer, and developed these patches using a least cost movement approach, which is slightly different than that the circuit theory based approach that I talked about before. But it maps the potentially the easiest route through the landscape, using that human influence kind of as a resistance layer, as I was talking about before. And so those little yellow lines on there represent how organisms might move to get from those slightly warmer places to the slightly cooler places and avoid human impacts on the way. The next thing that he said he wanted to do was to avoid steep climatic gradients. And the reason one might want to do that is because if you've got organisms that are living in a cool, say, subalpine or alpine environment, they may not be able to drop down into a warmer valley or an even hotter area to get into the next coldest place. Likewise, if you have organisms that live in a warm valley, they may not be able to go over a cold mountain pass to get to the next cooler, warm valley. So ideally, these organisms would follow climatic, they wouldn't traverse steep climatic gradients, but would follow along contours of temperature in this case. And you can imagine you can do this for moisture as well. So he designed routes that would avoid these steep climatic gradients. So these routes, which are different than the last ones I showed you, and you can tell if I flip back and forth like that. These avoid steep climatic gradients. So now he's got routes that do one thing and routes that do another. It took a little work, but he was able to figure out how to develop routes that do both. So these are routes that both avoid steep climatic gradients and avoid human land use. And so this is one way that one could potentially map connectivity across the landscape for all sorts of species, right? This could apply to plants and vertebrates and invertebrates. Jenny McGuire, who was a postdoc working with me, took that approach and she applied it to the whole US. And she said, okay, where are we in need of more connectivity? Where are there good linkages in the West and where in the United States, and where are there poorer linkages? And how difficult is it going to be for animals and plants to get to cooler patches of more intact landscape in the country? And as you can see, there's lots of longer purple routes in the eastern, particularly in the southeastern part of the US, where it's going to be much more difficult for organisms to find routes and find paths to cooler climates. So the next thing I said I was going to talk about was potentially protecting lands that serve as climatic refugia. And climatic refugia have been defined in a number of different ways for plants and animals, but one way being places that are going to change less on the landscape. They're going to see less climate change, where plants and animals might be able to subsist, where they might be able to hang out and not be heavily impacted by climate change. Another definition includes places where organisms might go in a changing climate. They might move to places that act as refugia, that'll either see less change or that are just suitable places that remain in the landscape. And a research scientist who's worked with me for a number of years developed an approach for identifying these climatic refugia on the landscape. And she did that by taking a whole bunch of different climate variables and creating a multivariate measure of climatic conditions, and then identifying what folks might call climate analogs or similar climatic conditions across the landscape. And so in this map, in this little grid I've got here, there's a central cell, and you can think of that as the focal cell. And there are places in the landscape that the climate is similar to that one cell, right? And she had to define that. She said, okay, how am I going to define an analogous climate? And that was the first step. Those are the places that are similar to that one in the landscape. But to do that, one has to have some kind of threshold to say how similar is a similar climate. You know, how far away in multidimensional climate space do you have to move before you move outside of that similar climate? And she did that by looking at the climatic niche breadth of a number of different taxonomic groups. And she found that amphibians tend to have a narrower climatic niche than do mammals and birds and trees. And she used that definition of their climatic niche to estimate a threshold for defining these climate analogs. And so she had two thresholds. She had one threshold that was based on amphibians' climatic niche, and one that was based on these other three taxa. So those are analogous climates, for example, for that one grid cell today or historically. And then she wanted to look at where those analogous climates would be in the future. And so in this example, they've shifted. So as the climate changes, those places that are suitable, that are analogous to that climate, have moved across the landscape or moved into a different place. And importantly, she wanted to say, well, just because they moved isn't necessarily cause for alarm. I mean, yes, species might have to track them, but more importantly, if they've shrunk, if the availability of that analogous climate has shrunk, she was going to call those refugia. So you can think of them as shrinking refugia potentially. And so she wanted to identify these places where analogous climates were shifting and shrinking, or just shrinking on the landscape. Okay. And then she said, well, organisms aren't going to be able to get to that from that center cell to all analogous climates, right? Because you can imagine some analogous climates could be very far away. So she's going to limit the distance from that focal cell within which one considers something a climate analog. And she did that again based on these different taxonomic groups, and said, what are the dispersal distances like for these groups? And we can estimate a potential radius within which we call something a climate analog based on those. And so she came up with 4 different thresholds based on these dispersal distances. And so now she's got 2 different niche distances and 4 different movement thresholds. So she used those to look at where we might find refugia on the landscape using a number of different climatic projections. And she did that for 2 different time periods, for the 2050s and the 2080s. And so here are places on the landscape for the 2050s that meet that definition of climatic refugia for one set of species with a certain distance across these 3 different models. And if we zoom in to Washington, a little bit of BC, you can see that a lot of the places that are popping out in that map tend to be higher elevations, right? They tend to be mountainous areas, which makes sense as the climate changes, and what's going to contract are likely to be those higher elevation climatic conditions are likely to shrink and move upslope potentially. If we look into the future a little farther, we see a shrinking of those refugia. Some show up in other places, but we also see a shrinking of those ones that we saw from the 2050s. So she then wanted to ask, well, we've got these refugia, how well are they protected today? And are there refugia in the protected areas we have already on the landscape? And so she overlaid them with a protected area map. And if you can see those little black polygons that showed up on that map are protected areas in North America. She asked a series of questions. She found that refugia cover, depending on how you define them and which of the calculations she used, they cover up to about 12% of North America. And protected areas, this set that she used, cover about 10% of North America. But the protected areas cover about up to 25% of the refugia. So the refugia area. So they're disproportionately capturing the refugia, which is good, right? That's a good thing if you're trying to protect refugia. And it's probably due to the fact that a lot of these refugia are at higher elevation and a lot of the protected areas are mountainous regions, right? About 40% of the protected areas contain some refugia, some cells that were defined as refugia, but about 75% of the areas she defined as refugia are not captured in these protected areas. So there are places that one could add to a reserve network or could potentially protect if it made sense to do so. Okay, so the last study I'm going to talk about is taking the idea of these corridors, the idea that we can potentially get an idea of where species might move to try by projecting the range changes, and the idea of refugia and integrate them into a conservation planning process. So conservation planners have for a long time tried to identify areas to protect based on, well, they originally were selecting areas to protect just based on what was available or for aesthetic reasons or opportunistically based on what's available. But more recently, they've been more systematic and have tried to protect areas that will protect the most species in the most ecosystems or other conservation targets. And so this approach tries to integrate projected future ranges and these elements of the landscape that might be useful for species in a changing climate. So the idea was to incorporate each of these things into a reserve network that would add to the current reserves, the current protected areas in the US. So this is a map of the current protected areas in the US, all the green areas, focus on the green blobs on that map. And so we asked where would we put potential places, where would we protect on that landscape? The first question is, where would we protect on that landscape if we wanted to increase the protection of species where they are today? So we looked at the current distribution of species and said, we want to protect them to a certain level, all species at the same level. Where would we go to do that? And to do that, we took land costs into account. We took species distributions into account. We took land costs into account. And in this case, we used an econometric model to estimate how much in general land might cost in each county. Right after we published the paper on this, one of my colleagues said, hey, I just developed this great new land cost data set for the whole US that's actually based on tax records. And it's probably much more accurate than the map we used. And so we gave him all our data and he reran it using the new cost data. The results qualitatively stayed the same, but the costs changed dramatically in terms of the total cost of what we estimated was much, much higher when you use the real cost data than these data. Okay, so we use land costs and we use the current distribution of species to look at where you protect in terms of the current range, but to figure out where you might protect to catch them in the future and where they are today. We used projected range shifts, again, using these correlative models, but using a different set of correlative models built at a much finer resolution with a different set of finer scale data. But it's the same idea, the same kinds of models. And then we use the corridor network that I talked about that Jenny McGuire put together using that corridor mapping approach that Tristan Nunez had produced. And then we used the refugia that came out of Julia's analysis. And we used those elements in the conservation planning process. And to do that, we used some conservation planning software. This is optimization software that basically finds the set of sites that costs the least, that protects the most of the targets possible. So it protects all the targets and minimizes the cost. Can do both those things, but we did the latter. So first we built a reserve network that added current species, that was based just on current species distributions, adding those to the existing reserve network. Then we built one that was added places that would protect species where they are today and where they will likely be in the future, given the climate projections. Then we added those future species distributions and the corridors. And then we added to that the refugia. And I'm just going to walk through what those reserve networks look like. So here are some places that one might add to the current reserve network if you were just trying to add places that would protect species where they are today and increase protection for species using their current distributions. If we look at the projections for the future, and we add places where the species are today and where they will likely be in the future, we get a slightly different map that adds a bunch of areas, and some areas kind of fall out from the original map. If we then add the corridors to that set of places, we end up with more places on the map. And finally, when we add the refugia, we end up with even more places on the map. And we can then look at how different they are when we take the climate change elements into account by looking at this map. So this map basically takes that map of the current, takes the map of that last map I showed you with all the climatic elements added in and subtracts from it that map that was based just on current species distributions. So the green areas that you see here are areas that were found to be important when you take those climatic elements into account, when you take climate change into account. And the pink areas are more important when you're not taking climate change into account. And then we looked at the cost of that network, and this is just the relative cost. It doesn't cost that much more. So to add in climatic refugia and corridors to the network, we also found, however, if you use the projected future ranges as where the species are likely to be in the future, that adding those two things doesn't really do a great job of capturing them. If you do try to capture them by adding the species future projected ranges in and trying to capture those, it does cost quite a bit more, as one might expect. And so to conclude, hopefully I've told you that species are going to move, and you've known that species are going to move in response to climate change. Some of them aren't going to be able to keep up with climate change, the rate at which the climate is changing. For those that are going to be able to move and keep up with climate change, it might do us some good to identify the particular areas on the landscape where lots of species are going to move and protect those. There are a number of ways to do that, particularly by protecting corridors that are designed to allow species to move in response to climate change, and potentially by protecting climatic refugia on the landscape where species might be able to persist or when they might move to as the climate changes. And I just want to acknowledge all the people I mentioned. These are some of the members of my lab who did the work that I mentioned. Carrie Schloss and Tristan Nunez and Jenny McGuire. And I didn't mention Scott Rinnan, who did the projections of the species distributions for that last study I talked about, and Julia Mahalik. All right. With that, I'll take any questions you have.